Hey everyone, Alexander here again for 30 Days of Symphony. And today we cap off our trilogy of the three most favorite of the nine. The official tally is nine. He wrote actually two others, but the official nine symphonies, the nine monumental symphonies of Anton Bruckner. When I always say that about how there are two others, you have to understand that Bruckner never wanted to go past the number nine in writing symphonies. Mahler also had this problem because the idea was that because Beethoven didn't get past nine symphonies, if you wrote a 10th symphony, you would be jinxed. So Bruckner wrote two symphonies early in his life and he didn't number them. And then he wrote his symphonies 1 through 9. Well, as I said, all of the Bruckner symphonies are monumental, and in the orchestral world, to one degree or another, are all famous. But probably the most famous of them are the three symphonies that we've been savoring this week. We, of course, began with Bruckner's Symphony No. 4, which he himself called his Romantic Symphony, which really was the breakout piece for this composer and organist who had just been dismissed as this country bumpkin from the Austrian countryside. Again, Bruckner grows up like, say, Dvorak, like Brahms, grows up in very humble village circumstances. He's trained to be a schoolmaster at 30, which then that was not young in the mid-19th century. At 30, he decides to become a professional musician. He becomes the local church organist in Linz, which is one of the great second cities of Austria. Then, soon after he turns 40, he becomes the court organist, the imperial court organist in Vienna, which is an incredibly prestigious job, but that paid very, very little money. But in the world of church organists, not much has changed. But Bruckner is a kid from the countryside, and I can't put into words how Bruckner spent his whole life feeling tremendously insecure. He was very shy, he was very naive. He never married through his entire life, lived in this little kind of shack, if you will, in the imperial palace grounds. And with the Seventh Symphony in E major, which he writes again, the slow movement, as he's learning of the death of the composer who was absolutely his idol, Richard Wagner, the ever controversial figure of Richard Wagner. It's the Seventh Symphony with its premiere by the Vienna Philharmonic in, 1884, that solidifies his international standing, in that here, along with his contemporary, we often think of Brahms as being later, or I should say, coming before Bruckner, but they were actually almost exact contemporaries. But Bruckner solidifies his reputation as being the Viennese composer who, along with Johannes Brahms, is finally a worthy successor as a symphonist to Beethoven. And remember, trying to succeed Beethoven as a symphonist was this challenge that almost completely destroyed the composers of the previous generation, Robert Schumann and Felix Mendelssohn, who, interestingly, both of whom met early deaths through overwork and mental illness, but it was Brahms and Bruckner leading these long, fruitful lives who finally, again, squared the circle of being a worthy successor to Beethoven as a composer of symphonies. Well, fresh off the international success with the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. Now remember, in the 1880s, Vienna is the musical capital of the world. Fresh off this success, Bruckner, for the first time in his long and lonely life, truly a lonely life in all ways, Bruckner finally feels like a gust of self-confidence. He has now gathered around him a band of admirers, devotees, who also kind of unfortunately try to correct him. They try to revise his scores, and that's where the saga of the Symphony No. 8 comes into play. Bruckner begins work on this symphony in 1880, probably 1885. He completes it in 1887. He sends the score to the conductor who was his great musical mentor, the man he called his artistic father, Hermann Levy, which is so bathed in irony because of course Bruckner's idol was Richard Wagner, who the not only one of the great composers but also one of the great anti-Semites of 19th century Europe. Wagner and Bruckner being and who they were long since dead by this time, but they ended up being the two favorite composers of Adolf Hitler. But Bruckner, while he's alive, his artistic father, as he called him, was this great German Jewish conductor of Wagner operas, Hermann Levy. So Bruckner completes his Symphony No. 8. He sends the score to Hermann Levy, and Levy very humbly says, Dear Bruckner, I love you, but I cannot begin to understand this piece. I can't conduct it right now. I just can't wrap my head around it. And you can't blame him because this symphony is over 90 minutes long. No one had ever written a symphony. I mean, the first movement of Bruckner 8 is longer than almost all of the symphonies of Haydn and Mozart and even early Beethoven and Schubert. So, poor Hermann Levy just didn't know what to make of this. Unfortunately, this devastated Bruckner, and then he went back and made all these revisions. And then he had all these friends and admirers who saw him, they adored his music, but they saw him as kind of like an idiot savant, someone who just didn't know the ways of the world and was completely unsophisticated in writing a symphony for a public audience. And they were like, dear Anton, you have to cut this back. So there are to this day two versions of the Bruckner 8th Symphony. There's an 1887 version, and there's an 1890 version. And the 1890 version has some significant cuts, but people all over the world still perform it. But there were, in the early 20th century, there emerged two great scholars of Bruckner's music. One was named Robert Haas, who did a complete Bruckner edition in the 1930s, which in many ways was just strictly musicologically a solid piece of work, but he was doing this under the auspices of the Nazi regime, and he also kind of was very presumptuous in making all these choices that he thought Bruckner would have made if only he had been smart enough to do so. After the war, there was commissioned in Vienna a new Bruckner critical edition. Dr. Leopold Novak did this edition, and this is the Novak editions are the ones that are currently and I think permanently the ones that we prefer to do because they are ultimately more faithful to Bruckner's original intentions. And you have to feel sorry for Bruckner. Again, he's this nice kid from the hinterlands, and here he is in Vienna, playing the organ at the Imperial Palace, and he's just the poor guy was just understandably profoundly insecure, just racked with self-doubt. That self-doubt is nowhere to be found in the 90-odd minutes of this symphony's gigantic 4 movements. Once again, as I've said before, it's like we talk about the Wagner influence on Bruckner, but really it's Schubert. It's these soaring melodies, these endlessly soaring melodies, in combination with the other greatest influence, Beethoven. Imagine this late classical symphony taken to these Matterhorn dimensions. The Beethoven influence is to be felt most of all in the rhythmic quality of the ideas. And with the very beginning of this Symphony number 8, you feel the gigantic ghost behind you of the opening of Beethoven Symphony number 9. Even the dotted rhythm, da, 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 dotted rhythms, doubly dotted rhythms, reminiscent of the main idea of the opening of Beethoven 9 are everywhere. Then there is this very Schubertian, lyrical, second thematic area, massive development section, glorious recapitulation again, in which Bruckner, again, he turns the symphony orchestra with its triple, quadruple wind and brass into a giant cathedral organ. The second movement is the scherzo, not the third. The scherzo, again, very reminiscent of Beethoven with this profoundly tranquil central trio section. Now, again, the Scherzo Trio scherzo pattern is a three-part form, but you have to realize that even the scherzo itself, in Bruckner's hands, that alone is a three-part ABA form. And then you get to the trio, which has its own ABA form, and then you repeat the scherzo. You just have to let it go. Just let it all wash over you, because the music is so incredibly gorgeous and so incredibly powerful. The third movement is the slow movement, the Adagio. The legendary, and I use that word advisedly, the truly legendary Adagio of the Bruckner Symphony No. 8. This is where the influence of Wagner. We've talked about Beethoven, Schubert. This is where the influence of Wagner comes to the fore. And it's so, in its harmony, and its structure, and its phrasing, very reminiscent of Bruckner's favorite Wagner opera, Tristan and Isolde. The greatest of all doomed love story operas, probably. But an opera that over Bruckner and hundreds of thousands of musicians, maybe even millions in the 19th century, just cast this spell like a drug, really like a musical drug, over just innumerable musicians and music lovers. Bruckner being one of the greatest of them. The finale, Beethoven comes back to the fore. And the main idea of the finale is, like, again, led by the brass. Bruckner loves his brass players. It is like a sped up version of that double dotted idea that was the principal idea of at the very beginning of the first movement. So Bruckner, in his own way, is developed. He never ever possessed, nor would he have wanted to possess, Brahms's gloriously complicated, method of developing variation. Remember, we were talking about Brahms, where Brahms takes these little ideas of 3 or 4, maybe even 2 or 3 or 4 notes, and then develops an entire movement. Bruckner is not into that. Bruckner is just designing, he's like building the arches of a great Gothic cathedral. Bruckner's like melodies, they're like flying buttresses at Notre Dame. Anyway, Bruckner also has his own sense of cyclic form. Again, the inspiration being the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. In the finale, where you remember the beginning of the finale of Beethoven 9, Beethoven brings back the principal themes from the previous 3 movements. Well, Bruckner does this, but not slavishly. Bruckner does it in his own brilliant way. And the absolute climax, I think, of the finale of Bruckner 8 is when he takes the principal themes of the 3 preceding movements, and he doesn't repeat them in succession. He literally superimposes them on top of each other. So these 3 melodies are in this blazing C major. They're playing all at the same time. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's like, as people have said, the Bruckner Eighth Symphony, it's like the Sistine Chapel in music. It's just a miracle. And again, by the time it ends in this incredible emphatic gesture, you have, for 96, 98 minutes, have really been spiritually to another world. The premiere of this Symphony No. 8 was again in Vienna by the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. Again, Vienna not only being the musical capital of the world at this time, but being a very conservative place where actually the progressive, if you will, conservatism of Johannes Brahms was much preferred to the Wagnerian, the huge spanned Wagnerian style of Bruckner. Bruckner was by far the simpler personality, but he was viewed as the radical, which is something poor Bruckner couldn't understand, because Bruckner just had to write the music that was in him that he had to, give to the world. But the premiere of the Symphony No. 8 was December 18th, 1892. Again, the great Hans Richter, one of the great conductors of the 19th century, was conducting. And for once, I'm going to quote somebody else's words, far more eloquent than mine. Among the members of the audience at that world premiere was the great, then a young man, the great Austrian song composer, Hugo Wolf. If you love the art song, you know about Wolf's immortal art songs. But Hugo Wolf, after the premiere, wrote to a friend, and I quote, "This symphony is the creation of a giant, and it towers above all the other symphonies of this great master in its spiritual dimensions, in its fertility and its grandeur. Despite the most Cassandra-like predictions of disaster, even among the initiated, again, even among those who were Bruckner's, great devotees, even among the initiated, the success of this symphony was almost without parallel. It was a complete victory of the powers of light over darkness. As each of the individual movements ceased to sound, a storm of enthusiasm broke out in the hall with an elemental violence. In short, no Roman emperor could have wished for a greater triumph." Not bad for a kid from the hinterland. Anton Bruckner, Symphony No. 8, here in one of the great filmed performances of its time from the late 1970s. Herbert von Karajan conducts the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra.